Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Ling, and this is The Road to a Vaccine, an exploration of the COVID-19 crisis and the global community's efforts to develop a vaccine against the disease. It has been quite a week with a few rays of hope and what feels like far too many setbacks. But last week, 9 companies working on investigational COVID-19 vaccines, including J&J, announced the signing of the historic We Stand with Science pledge, which is a commitment to continue to adhere to rigorous science and safety in their COVID-19 vaccine development. Let's take a look at the numbers this week. As of today, there are over 29 million cases, another million since last week, and over 926,000 deaths globally. Countries across Europe are on the verge of a second wave as cases increase again. Israel reported almost 4,000 new cases in one day last week, bringing the case count to over 155,000 since the pandemic began. The country is going into a 3-week national lockdown during its highest holy days, making it possibly the first country in the world to impose a second general lockdown because of a resurgence in infections. Now, we have an incredible lineup of guests on the show today, and if you have any questions, put them in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get them answered. First, we're going to be talking to Ling, co-founder, along with actor Sean Penn, of Community Organized Relief Effort, or CORE, about the important work they're doing to bring COVID testing to communities most impacted by the pandemic. And pediatrician Dr. Todd Willin will be here to talk about his campaign to stop disinformation around vaccines. Plus, Fiona Lowenstein, a young woman in her 20s who was hospitalized with COVID, will talk about what it's like to be a long hauler who is still battling COVID. She'll also dispel some of the common myths about COVID patients. But first, COVID testing is a key component to reopening safely, yet access to testing isn't necessarily the norm. I'm going to be talking to Ling, CEO and co-founder of CORE, with actor Sean Penn. Now, CORE's mission is to save lives and strengthen communities affected by or vulnerable to crisis. During COVID, they've partnered with community organizations across the U.S. to make testing accessible for vulnerable populations. Ling, welcome to the show. I think that you are coming to us from inside of a trailer. Where are you?
I am. I'm in a trailer at Dodger Stadium. It's where we have our largest capacity testing site in Los Angeles.
And what all are you doing there at Dodger Stadium, and how many people are you servicing?
So right now we have about 6 sites in Los Angeles, Dodgers being the largest. We can have about 5,000 people tested per day here on average. Usually in Los Angeles, we're seeing about between 10 to 15,000 people per day. Essentially, we are partnered with Mayor Garcetti's office and the Los Angeles Fire Department, and we provide free testing for folks here in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. And we've spread out all of our other locations in very vulnerable neighborhoods as well, in South Los Angeles, as well as in East Los Angeles and a number of other areas for accessibility.
Now, are you the main organization there at Dodger Stadium? Because it's a massive location, and you are seeing so many thousands of people.
We're actually the only organization here. We definitely don't do it alone. We have Los Angeles Fire Department, who's been an incredible support and partner to this. Curative, which is the lab partner, who's actually also a wonderful resource for us. And then, of course, the LA Mayor's office. But as an operational entity, we're the only organization managing all of these 6 sites.
And can you talk about some of the trends that you're seeing? Are you seeing positive cases start to decrease in recent weeks?
We are, but strangely enough, we're also seeing a huge amount of folks sort of dropping off this testing cycle. So there are not as many people testing as there were before. And we're seeing this not here just in Los Angeles, but we're also in several other cities. We're in about over 35 locations across the United States. And we're seeing a drop off in demand for testing all over. But we are seeing.
And to what do you attribute that?
It's unclear. I think that, what worries us the most is that there's probably a sense of complacency that, we've now figured out how to live with this crisis and it's not needed. We do hope, especially after this holiday, Labor Day weekend, that we'll see more of a demand. But essentially, it does give us a moment of pause and worry, because we don't think that this is by any means close to being over yet.
Yeah, and especially as we start to head into the fall and flu season starting. A lot of concerns about that period. And you founded CORE along with Sean Penn to provide relief to communities during and after disaster strikes. I followed the incredible work that you did in Haiti after the devastating earthquake there, and in numerous U.S. states and countries after natural disasters. You're now conducting COVID testing in some of the most vulnerable parts of the US. Why have you felt as an organization that you had to do this?
For us, just watching what was happening in the United States, and not just the failure of leadership, but just the absolute abdication of leadership in this testing space, given that we had flexible funding and sort of, our niche is that we have a lot of ability to take on bigger risks and kind of figure things out operationally. We focus on the most vulnerable. And that was such a huge gap, that we just felt the need to be able to step in. And that's what we did. We just stepped in and, thanks to amazing partners like, Mayor Garcetti and the Fulton County in Atlanta or in Georgia, we've been able to kind of exponentially learn, grow, and kind of replicate in other areas.
The federal government has led us to believe that anyone, anywhere can get testing, that it's totally accessible to anyone. How would you respond to that?
That is a lie. That is a fundamental lie. And especially starting this out months ago, watching the cities and working with the cities to find out where they can even get access to test kits it felt like a drug deal. It felt like, having to back channel relationships and sort of very, very, there's lack of transparency. And it was just through the sheer will and force of people's connections and sort of harassing to be able to get these test kits in a way that could actually have any impact on the public. So that is a categorical lie. Yeah.
And we're taking questions from people who are watching. And I have a question from Adam from Facebook who asks, can anyone get one of your tests? Do you have to sign up?
You do have to sign up, but if you come to the sites, we will sign you up. If you don't have it, it just makes the process much easier and faster for you. You can easily go on our website, coreresponse.org. You can find all the test sites, the locations, times, dates, and you can basically sign up readily. And again, you do not need insurance. You can, if you have insurance, we encourage people to put that in there because it helps pay for folk who do not have insurance. But anyone can get tested. You do not need documentation, any sort of, papers or insurance. It's for free.
And Victor from LinkedIn is asking, what kind of test are you utilizing?
Right now, we're using an oral self-administered test here in Los Angeles. It is a diagnostic, a PCR test. In several different cities that we're working in, we're using diagnostic PCR tests only for right now. And but it's different. We have mid-terminate nasals, we have some oral, so it's a mix. But essentially here in Los Angeles, they're all oral self-administered.
Now, I know you've been working with the Navajo Nation. Tell us about what the needs are there and what kinds of disparities you've witnessed firsthand.
I have to say, Navajo Nation actually gave us the positive example of what to do and how to do things better. They saw a huge spike very early on, and they were able to manage it. And the case positives have been decreasing. We've been working with Johns Hopkins University to increase testing, but not just testing in a vacuum, testing with tracing. And we're providing with our partners resources to allow for families to safely quarantine. And it's this full stream of integrated activities that has seen an impact on decreasing the number of case positives. So after learning this and seeing this actually have an impact in where, the case positives, there was almost at 24% above, the average, when it was still the highest case in bigger cities were like 12%. Essentially, we took that model and we have been using that in Atlanta to inform our activities there. So there we're doing testing, we're doing the case investigation and contact tracing, as well as the resource mobilization, because what we realize is testing by itself is not going to have an impact on anything. You know, you need to have an integrated messaging system. You need to have the contact tracing and help people who need the most help to be able to quarantine safely to do so. You can't expect a family who lives in a home of 12 other people with no running water to and tell them, you know, quarantine safely. So you need to provide those resources to make sure that the most vulnerable have that support to be able to do that.
And can you give us some insights on how you are helping people to better quarantine?
So essentially, for example, in Navajo Nation, what we have is we have a food partner that's providing about 2 weeks worth of food. That's World Central Kitchen, our favorite, wonderful partner, Jose Andres, as well as we're doing shelters for elders, where we're building out actual physical shelters, protecting the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. The folks that are living in, you know, conditions where they won't be able to safely quarantine, we're building immediate shelters, which take 2 days for them to be there to avoid getting sick, as well as hygiene kits. We have a number of hygiene kits. The minute you get tested, you're sent home with a hygiene kit, and if you're tested positive, then you get additional support through those hygiene kits, food boxes, and that shelter. So it's these wraparound services that are so critical in Navajo Nation. And in Atlanta, again, learning from this positive experience, in Atlanta, we're working with all these local CBOs who have that trust locally in these vulnerable neighborhoods to ensure that people have access to housing, alternative housing, food, whether it's to sign up for Medicare, Medicaid, as well as mental health services, and a number of sort of, again, wraparound services.
You know, as I mentioned earlier, Anne, I've been following the work that you all have been doing with CORE for many years, and really exceptional work you've been doing in so many parts of the world, particularly those that are considered very vulnerable. Are you surprised that your organization is having to provide this level of support here in the United States? I mean, I would think that these are the kinds of services, right, that governments would provide.
You know, in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. I mean, we've already seen in a number of hurricanes that we've responded to that we always know which communities are going to get hit. It's not rocket science. The folks that get hit the hardest and have the hardest time to recover usually is an intersection between poverty, race, and inequality. And so we can almost map out exactly, you know, where the trajectory of a hurricane might hit with the communities that have those issues and basically focus in on those because they get hit the hardest and the most. So it's not a surprise in terms of where it's hitting and why it's hitting these communities. They have been excluded economically and, you know, there's just so much against them. But yes, in terms of the surprise is realizing that, you know, where government entities should have stepped up, they were incapable to do so. And the fact that the public sector, as well as the private sector, has not only stepped up significantly, but has to continue to do so is quite a disappointment. And again, you know, coming from Haiti, where you saw after the earthquake, where I was living and experienced and lived through, you know, you saw sort of the powers that be that were also hit were incapable to actually respond. Here, it's less of the lack of capacity, but the lack of will and the lack of leadership. And so for us, that is quite, that's a gut punch to us.
Well, it's really incredible that you have been able to step in and fill the void. I have another question, Anne, from Ashish from LinkedIn, who's asking, what are the criteria taken into consideration for testing? Would it not be better to confine those who show symptoms?
For us, again, because we're seeing that 20% of the folk that are asymptomatic are really sort of increasing the amount of spread, they have an inordinate amount of impact on the rest of us when they are asymptomatic. Catching those asymptomatics are so important. So right now, because we have the capacity, right now we have about 15,000 per day that we can do, and we can easily ramp up to 25,000. And that's not even getting reached. So we have way more capacity to test people than actually people getting tested. So for us, the idea of limiting the tests for just symptomatics doesn't make sense. We need to catch the asymptomatics as quickly as possible.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for being a guest on our show, and thank you for the incredible work that you're doing with Sean Penn for CORE, the organization that you both founded. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you so much for having me. Hope to see you at Dodgers soon.
I'm definitely going to come visit. I want to see how the operation is working. See you soon. Thank you. Now, for all of you watching, whether on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, remember to put your questions in the comment section, and we will do our best to get them answered. In case you're just joining us, this is the Road to a Vaccine, an exploration of the COVID-19 crisis and the global community's efforts to develop a vaccine against the disease. We are live and taking your questions, so please keep them coming. Our next guest is Dr. Todd Wallin, a leading pediatrician and CEO of Kids Plus Pediatrics in Philadelphia. He has been on a quest to bring awareness to the science behind why we need vaccines. Dr. Wallin, thank you so much for joining us. You've been involved.
We're in Pittsburgh.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I knew that you were in Pittsburgh. I misread. Sorry about that.
No problem.
You've been involved in vaccine studies over the years, and you've been very outspoken, fighting back against vaccine opponents who attack your practice on social media. So why have you felt this need to speak out, and have you changed your approach to communicating about vaccines, just given how much skepticism there is?
Yeah, I did clinical vaccine research for 14 years. I've been doing vaccine communication and confidence research for the last few years, but it all really came to a head when we very innocently put together a 90-second video just about using the HPV vaccine as cancer prevention. It had 3 weeks of wonderful responses, lots of views, people making appointments. But then in mass, we were one of the very first victims of a global coordinated anti-vaccine attack, simply for just a 90-second video saying, get your HPV vaccine. It's a great way to prevent cancer. And so what we realized was that these attacks were now becoming larger, more coordinated, and more effective. And not only were they closing down or silencing onesie-twosie doctor offices throughout the country, they were actually silencing large quaternary health systems. As a matter of fact, after we went through this whole ordeal and we were on the cover of the LA Times, we had a quaternary health system with a nine-person communications team call to speak to our communications director, Chad Herman, saying, our CEO and CFO just told us to go silent on vaccines headed into flu season for fear of a social media attack. So we decided enough's enough. I mean, vaccines are one of the most important public health measures we have. And so we fought back. We did research with the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health and have a journal article in the journal Vaccine. We're working on another one. We created a toolkit to help vaccine advocates prepare, defend, and clean up from these attacks. And we created a digital rescue network to help people who are being attacked. And finally, an awareness campaign. So I frequently go out to talk about people need to realize this is an organized movement that while they do it under the auspices of, oh, we're doing it for altruism and safety, and we want government out of your business, they actually make profit. They actually do it for political gain. And finally, they do so for power. And don't forget, there's sometimes hostile foreign countries trying to sow distrust in our own institutions.
I imagine your job has gotten significantly harder now with discussion about the COVID vaccine because of, for example, the time frame that we're operating on with regard to this particular vaccine for COVID. Never before has a vaccine been developed at this pace. So would you say that things have gotten more difficult for you as someone who is an advocate for vaccines?
Yeah, I would tell you initially, healthcare providers thought that if there was any silver lining to the pandemic, it would be a real example of what the world looks like without herd immunity, right? This is the perfect example. It crippled economies. It's killing hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million, as you pointed out at the beginning. It's devastating communities, just like we heard from Anne from CORE. And so we thought, what a perfect opportunity to at least emphasize the importance of vaccines. But what we see is that the anti-vaccine movement is a much better organized and coordinated force, and actually used the disorganization and the chaos to create more chaos by spreading disinformation. And so that's one of the reasons we created a nonprofit called Shots Heard Around the World at www.shotsheard.org. And we're also working with a group called stronger.org, which which is really fighting disinformation against science, medicine, and vaccines, because we're hardwired for threat, right? It's called clickbait, right? If you see, oh, Bill Gates is injecting microchips, which is not true, in the new vaccine, and all these conspiracies, it's called clickbait. And the social media platforms have a responsibility to stop it. They've not been so good so far. The other thing that we tell people, besides the disinformation campaigns, and particularly what our organization Shots Heard does, is fight against weaponized social media. So what they did to our practice was, the attackers weren't in our community. They were in New Zealand and Texas and California, but they went after our Google ratings. They went after our Yelp ratings. And like I say to people, would you, our rating went from 4.8 down to less than a star. And I say to people, if you went to look for tacos that night, would you say, well, there's this 4.5 star taco stand there and a 1 star taco stand. Let's see if these are fraudulent reviews. Of course not. You just go to the higher rated taco stand. And so they've been allowed to weaponize using these platforms. And so we're calling the social media platforms out about their responsibility. And we did fight back, and Yelp was pretty responsive. Google, not so responsive.
Well, what percentage of people do you think what percentage of people do you think we have in the US that are pro-vaccine, and what percent are vaccine hesitant? Can you quantify that?
Yeah, there have been lots of studies in the US and abroad by the World Health Organization as well. About 75% of people in the US are considered vaccine accepting, meaning if you make a recommendation, they're usually very comfortable in saying, yes, let's go ahead and get that vaccine. About 23% are considered vaccine hesitant. Those are people that have questions, and there's nothing wrong with having questions. The sad thing is that physicians aren't particularly trained in communication, and we definitely aren't trained on social media, but we need to be, because the 1% to 2% that are considered anti-vaccine have had a decade of development of organizing on social media. And sadly, look, it's a fallacy to think that you're going to impart all your wisdom in a 10 or 15-minute visit, and that person's going to walk out and say, oh, I know everything I need to know about everything. But this is where they're at every day. And for healthcare providers, they think it's beneath us to be here, or maybe HIPAA might be violated. And that, again, this is not the case. There's ways to use social media. It's part of the reason that I'm on Twitter and on TikTok and on LinkedIn, and a lot of social media platforms, because I can take time to answer questions here. As a matter of fact, you asked, how has it changed how I've communicated? I certainly take time to listen to people's concerns, because we need to use active listening. And also, when they, if they're not accepting and say, well, I have some concerns, I ask them to share more with me. I actually mirror back their concerns so they know I'm listening. It's almost what they call feeling felt, right? They understand that I understand it. So now I say, oh my God, you heard that vaccine can sterilize your child? I'd be terrified if I thought that was true. And I share more information with you. And learning how to communicate more effectively allows an open dialogue. But again, this is what allows us to leverage that conversation 365 days a year. And so I really enjoy engaging families and parents from all over the world on social media.
Can you mention those websites again for people who want to better understand?
So for vaccine advocates, shotsheard.org. So www.shotsheard.org, and then stronger.org are the two groups that are really working to fight disinformation. Kids Plus Pediatrics, our practice, has really been trying to be a model of how to use social media and communication. We have a full-time communications director. I'm sitting here in our production studio because we believe it's this important to be able to reach our families in a potent way, to be able to answer the questions and be responsive to them. So feel free to visit Kids Plus Pediatrics as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to encourage people watching who do have concerns. And look, a lot of us do. This is unprecedented, but there are resources out there for people to become familiar with. And Dr. Woolens just mentioned a couple of them. You are a pediatrician, and we are in this phase where kids are getting back to school, mostly from a distance. And here in LA, for example, the county just recommended to avoid trick-or-treating. It seems like nothing is normal anymore, and parents are worried about the impact that this is having on children, both academically and socially. So what are some warning signs that parents can look for, and what can we do to help our kids, stay safe and stay sane during this difficult time?
Yeah, as a pediatrician, what we tell people is, and we have an early child developmental specialist, Diana Schwab, that really lets our families know that people are balancing a lot of change right now. And that's adults and it's kids. And it really has affected everybody. It doesn't matter where you are in the community. Everybody's dealing with change. The key is to really focus on promoting a sense of security and connectedness. visits with families, with family members, friends, and teachers. Now, I know that's hard because some of that is virtual. What we are telling people is that you're going to see perhaps random changes, a restless night. That might be pretty typical with all the changes going on. But if you see a pattern of multiple restless nights or a variety of changes, so in eating habits and sleep and daily activities, that's a little bit more of a concerning sign to us. And it's okay to acknowledge to your kids that there's a lot of change going on. But that being said, we don't want to really make the child worry and say these are dangerous. It's just we tell them it's your body's way of telling us something's not right now for you, and let's get some resources. I will say our practice, as our most practices now, have virtual support. There's a lot of telemental health support and other resources that are coming out through schools, pediatric offices. We work closely with the American Academy of Pediatrics, so they have a bunch of great articles as well.
Thank you so much for that information. Before you go, I just want to ask a question that is coming to us from Facebook. It's about vaccines. Sure. Again. Doesn't it take years for a vaccine to be truly effective?
Yeah. I will say that the current administration did not do us favors by using terms warp speed. But what's different about this current development is that we were allowed to cut off several years because of this unified front at national levels globally, where governments were putting a lot of the money, taking a lot of the risk out of the development. And there's already previously established technologies that we're building upon for some of these vaccines as well. And so I share people's concerns when they hear warp speed and they see the politicization of vaccines. But as long as these vaccines go through the necessary phase 1, 2, and 3 studies, just like the pledge that was made by the 9 companies. And as Dr. Fauci said, as long as we see all the appropriate steps being taken and showing safety and efficacy, then I think we're going to find ourselves with some really good vaccine options. I was just so glad that the companies took a pledge and said, we're not going to bow to political pressure. We're going to complete the studies to show the necessary data to prove safety and efficacy.
Dr. Todd Willin coming to us from Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, if you have any questions for our guests, please remember to always put them in the comment section and we'll do our best to get them answered. Our next segment is our educational segment, Vaccines 101, where we talk to scientists about the latest vaccine developments. Today, we have Dr. Mathai Mammen, Global Head of R&D at Johnson & Johnson on the show. Dr. Mammen, thank you so much for joining us. As a Global Head of R&D, you oversee many different divisions. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly you do at J&J?
Sure thing. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for having me on. So like all pharmaceutical companies, there are different divisions within the pharmaceutical company. One of them is the research and development group. So the research and development group must imagine something that is needed with patients based on unmet need today, and be completely cognizant of and move the science so as to invent something that meets that unmet need. So one of the groups within my organization, so I run that research and development organization, one of those groups develops vaccines. So it imagines what the world might need. We work on a variety of vaccines, including one for HIV, respiratory syncytial virus, E. coli disease. But since the pandemic began, we jumped on a vaccine, as you know, for COVID-19. So that's my role, is to oversee research and development in the pharmaceutical division.
And can you give us an update on J&J's vaccine? Like what's happening now on a daily basis?
Oh, sure. Yeah, just zooming out for a second, I have to say that the team is highly motivated right now. I've never seen anything like this in my professional career, and everyone believes that this is our moment. You know, and there are documentaries about war efforts, et cetera, where people are working nonstop. It's a bit like that inside J&J right now. So, you know, everyone, lots of like hundreds of people have worked pretty much every weekend and weekdays since the pandemic began in February and March. So what we've been doing is we've taken a very disciplined scientific approach to the development of the vaccine. We began with the hypothesis of which protein it is on the surface of the virus that would be most amenable to making a vaccine, which would be most likely effective. And we picked one of those proteins called spike protein. And then we did an experiment that not a lot of the other companies did, but we made many variants of that spike protein to find out which one was the best at inducing a strong immune response preclinically before we ever went to humans. And one of those proved head and shoulders above the others, and that's the one that we took forward into people. So what we did then was we did a variety of confirmatory studies. We extensively tested the safety of the vaccine before it ever touched a human being. And then we started our human phase 1 studies, so to speak. Phase 1 is the first of several phases of studies, back on July 21st. And so right now we're in this phase 1 early development setting where we're collecting lots of data on about 1,000 people. And those data tell us a lot more about safety and tolerability in a human being. And it teaches us about how strong an immune response we're able to draw when you administer the vaccine. So at this point right now, we're awaiting all these data. We're going to look at them and select the right amount or dose of the vaccine to put into a late phase, a phase 3 study. And so the phase 3 study, I'm pretty committed to having the team start in September. So a lot has to happen over the coming 2-3 weeks, where we look at data, we make decisions, we make a decision on dose, and then we start a study. There are numerous things that are actually very unusual about this study, and maybe one of them just to speak about, and we can touch on any aspect you wish. But one of them is normally you know where there are sick people. Like on any of our other cancer or autoimmune diseases, we know where to go to run the trial. Here, the pandemic moves around the world. It started in one place, moves to another. It lasts in sort of epidemic or this very bad form, a surge form, for maybe like 2-3 months, and then it disappears from that area, and it might come back, it might go somewhere else. So we've had to use extensive modeling and simulation, so-called data science, within the company to project where the pandemic is moving. Because as you can imagine, the only way to tell if your vaccine is working is to separate into 2 parts your trial, a placebo-dosed group of individuals and a vaccinated group, and be able to tell that there's a difference. And the vaccinated group is protected from getting sick. But in order for that to happen, you have to go to where the pandemic's actually happening.
And that's what you call chasing the virus, is that correct?
Chasing the virus. It's extensive data and data analytics.
Mathai, I want to ask you, on the heels of last week's news, could you explain the principles of clinical trials and the system of checks and balances that are in place to ensure that patient safety is the #1 priority?
Yeah. So it's, as you said, there's no more important priority to me personally than the safety of an individual, the safety of a human being that's vaccinated. So it's what drives me. It's what drives me on all the different programs. And we bend over backwards to make sure that that's the case for every one of our products, including this vaccine. So just to touch on a question that you had spoken about previously, we're actually not compromising on any aspect of any part of this program by moving fast. There are 2 reasons we can move fast. One is we're doing much more in parallel than in sequence. So we're investing like hundreds of millions of dollars in manufacturing before we even had preclinical data, let alone human clinical data. Normally you wouldn't do that, and if you kept doing that, you'd run your business aground. But because this is an emergency, a pandemic situation, we did that, of course. But that can save a lot of time by moving in parallel. And the other is for normal vaccine programs, the incidence rates of the illness you're trying to prevent are what they are. They're relatively low in the world, but the incidence rate for this pandemic is very high. So you can tell the difference between a vaccinated person and a not vaccinated maybe in months instead of years. So this too is a second factor that saves a lot of time in the program. So the normal process is you do extensive preclinical work, and as we've described, like you make sure that the efficacy is likely to be strong, you make sure that the safety is likely to be high, and then you go confirm that in a phase 1 study. A phase 1 study's purpose is exactly that, safety and tolerability, and you try to touch on different groups, different vulnerable groups, elderly individuals, young people, everyone that you can to test the preliminary safety of your vaccine. Then you do normally a phase 2 study where you look at different doses and you find out some optimization if there are any trade-offs between tolerability, like pain in your arm, or expected effects of a vaccine, and its overall ability to induce a really powerful, robust immune response. And so that's the phase 1, 2A part, and I call that just early development. Then you move into a big phase, a large phase, which several companies, including us, are going to be in momentarily, where you do a phase 3 study. Normally there, you pick one dose of your vaccine or your medicine, and you separate the placebo from the treated individuals, and you measure long enough so that you can see a difference. A very important part of that phase 2 is safety, because you have much more experience. At J&J, we've chosen to vaccinate 60,000 people in the phase 3 portion. Part of that is to get extensive experience in a large population, including multiple subgroups that are very important. And that's extremely important to us and to me personally to do that. And so the safety this is worth the audience knowing. The safety is assessed in multiple ways by multiple groups. Within the group, there are groups of physicians that are looking at it constantly. Within J&J, there's a separate medical safety group that's completely independent of the first group that also looks at safety independently. And then outside of J&J, there's a group of individuals that's put together for a trial like this that's completely independent, has nothing to do with J&J or any company, and they look in and monitor the safety of the ongoing trial independently. And then finally, we have FDA or other regulatory bodies in different countries in the world that are looking at all the safety and efficacy together and making a judgment independently of everything that I said before, every other group. So there are
this is such a helpful explanation. I mean, there are quite a number of companies that are in trials for their COVID vaccine candidate. But there's also an unprecedented level of information sharing, data sharing. How did that happen, and why is that so important?
Yeah, no, this is such a important topic to me. I think that at the beginning of this crisis, it was really interesting. There were several of us that headed up the R&D groups of different companies that this is back in February and March, said, is this really happening? Are we closing down like labs? And so there was a initial set of interactions that was due to just how are we handling this, but that quickly morphed to we need to help. We need to do everything we can and not be competitors for change. Let's try to help one another move this whole process along to get both therapeutics and vaccines to the world. And so within the vaccine world, I've had the privilege of leading that effort with the COVID-19 R&D Alliance, and it's been amazing. And almost all companies have participated in this by advising each other on endpoints to measure efficacy, what best ways there are of predicting where the pandemic's moving, what elements of the protocol might be thorny, and we need to just help each other work through any issues. All the things that go into a clinical trial we were trying to be helpful with, except, of course, the vaccine candidate itself. And that's the piece where we would work on our own vaccines, but in every other regard, we're sharing information. And then what we're committing to right now is working with the FDA, the NIH, trying to get to a place where we can share the data from the phase 3 studies as well in two ways. One is the efficacy data, and the other is the immunogenicity data, the immune response. Because if you can tell the relationship between what level of antibodies you have or what level of T cells you have and efficacy, that's going to be true across a variety of vaccines. So if one or two companies cross the threshold and start to understand that relationship, then that will help the following companies understand what their bar is to get to high efficacy. So that's a really important piece of it that hasn't happened yet because no phase 3 studies are complete.
Right. Mathai, I have a question from Carolyn from LinkedIn who asks, can we expect the vaccine to possibly be made available at the same time globally, or will it be prioritized one region above or over another?
Yeah, so J&J, we're a global organization, and we're committed to, as fast as possible, beginning with the most vulnerable populations globally in every place in the world. And so we're talking to regulatory agencies around the world. Our phase 3 study is planned to be global, so it's in many countries, including the United States. And so we'll prioritize vulnerable individuals and then go to everybody. And we're committed to over 1 billion doses, billion regimens of the vaccine in 2021, and we're ramping really fast after that. So as are other companies. So we're hoping that there are several successful companies here that can vaccinate most or all of the world.
We have another question from Mustafa from LinkedIn, who asks, what is the data saying about the safety and efficacy of the trials across the many COVID strains?
So right now, so one silver lining in all of this is SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. There aren't a plethora of strains like there are influenza or other kinds of viruses. The virus is relatively stable. There is one variant that's popped up, but all the data right now from the different companies would say that the vaccines that are being developed work against both those variants. And so we're working, right, and the virus, when it's this active in the human population, has the best chance of mutating because it's replicating all the time. And if we haven't seen a lot of variations or variants yet, my suspicion is we won't. So we're gonna be able to, I think, develop a vaccine to successfully protect against this virus.
One of the only possible silver linings in all of this, right, Dr. Mathai?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. That has been so helpful, and we hope to have you back on the show again, Dr. Mathai Mammen from J&J. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Pleasure.
Now that we're over 7 months into this, there's an emerging population of long-haul survivors, people who are still experiencing debilitating medical issues long after they've supposedly recovered from COVID. Here to shed more light on this is Fiona Lowenstein, founder of Body Politic, a growing COVID-19 support group and community resource. Fiona is also one of our team members here at the Road to a Vaccine, so I want to welcome her to the show. Fiona, so good to see you. I've been wanting to get you on the show for a long time because I've been so moved by the advocacy that you are taking out there, putting out there in the world. So tell us about your story. When did you first get sick, and were you surprised that it could get so severe given your young age? You're still in your 20s.
Yeah, definitely. I got sick very early in kind of the virus's trajectory across the US. So I live in New York City, and I'm fairly certain that I was infected on March 10th by a friend who came to my apartment for one last in-person, hangout. And I saw her get sick before my eyes. She went home immediately. And then 3 days later, I had symptoms. So I think, my experience was somewhat unusual in that I was really part of that first wave of patients. And my initial symptoms were somewhat classic COVID symptoms. I had a fever, I had respiratory issues, there was the cough, shortness of breath, and I ended up being hospitalized for shortness of breath for a couple of days in March. This was a surprise to me. I mean, all of the news stories at that time were making the assumption that young people, if they caught this virus, would be able to ride it out at home or certainly would recover more quickly. And so the one kind of silver lining of this early experience of being infected by a friend was that I had another COVID patient that I could talk to through those first couple of weeks when there was still so much misinformation and I myself knew very little about the virus. But after I was discharged from the hospital, I expected to get better quickly. I'm young, I'm 26, I have no pre-existing conditions. And that wasn't really what happened. I developed a whole new slew of symptoms. There were GI issues, sinus pain, runny nose, sore throat, cognitive and neurological issues, dermatological issues, intense fatigue. And these symptoms lasted through early June. So it was about 3 months. And at the time, the World Health Organization was saying that patient should only remain sick for about 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks. So this was a surprise to me. Of course, now we know that there are many long haul patients out there. And I think it's important that people understand that this condition can also occur with young folks.
And are you experiencing anything now, 7 months into the COVID crisis?
So I'm one of the lucky ones. I seem to have made a full recovery, and I think in many ways my case, although it can seem very scary because of course I was young and I was hospitalized and I stayed sick for so long, in many ways my case is still a best case scenario. I did not face major barriers to accessing care. I got sick kind of right at the perfect time that, it was just before New York was becoming really overwhelmed and emergency rooms were having to turn away dozens of patients. So I was able to access testing. I was able to test positive for the virus. Similarly, I have health insurance through New York State, so the majority of my nearly $14,000 medical bill was covered. And I also had the luxury to kind of live off of my savings and dial back my work and actually take the time to recover, which I think is a big part of the reason why, I'm here today talking to you and not still experiencing symptom relapse and some of these things that patients are still dealing with, 5-6 months down the line.
Well, you've been able to gather so much information about the lingering effects and symptoms that long haulers are experiencing because you started Body Politic, the Body Politic COVID-19 support group, where you are gathering information from long haul survivors. How did your experience help you or inform your decision to want to start this support group?
So again, kind of the only silver lining of those early weeks was having, a friend who was a COVID patient as well, who I could talk with. And it was important because we were able to offer each other emotional support, but we were also able to validate each other's experiences. So, she was never able to access COVID testing in March and April because New York was so overwhelmed. And so when I got my positive test result, it to her was almost confirmation that she had the virus as well. Similarly, we were talking about some of these lesser known symptoms that were not being covered. She was saying to me, have you lost your sense of smell? And I was saying, yes, I have. And so, there was a certain amount of kind of, even at that point, just community info sharing to kind of fill some of those gaps in, what wasn't being covered by the mainstream media. So we realized early on that there were lots of COVID patients out there who could benefit from this same peer support. I also started sharing my story on social media in those early days because I wanted to, help spread the word that someone young could get this sick. And I wrote about my experience in the New York Times, and I started being contacted by, dozens of patients from all over the world. Similarly, a lot of them wanted emotional support. A lot of them also had tangible questions like, how did you know when to go to the hospital? Or what did they do for you there? Or, what did the nasal swab feel like? And so we thought that if we could get all these patients together, actually talking to one another, we could really expand this community. So we launched the group in late March. And in the kind of first 2 weeks that it existed, it was small, maybe 30 or so patients on Instagram. And I started to notice that a lot of these patients were young. A lot of them had been sick for about a month, and a lot of them were not getting any better. So I wrote a second article in the New York Times, which I think honestly might be one of the first reported pieces on what we would now know as long haul COVID. I linked to the support group in that piece. And after it went up, we had over 2,000 patients sign up for the support group overnight. So it was obvious that there was a huge demand for this. And the group has just continued to grow. I mean, we've had almost 20,000 people sign up. We have over 8,000 active members. There's a patient-led research team that has grown out of this group, as well as a variety of grassroots efforts. We've met with the World Health Organization. We're in touch with the CDC and the NIH. And I think now I like to think of, our global support group as almost a headquarters for the emerging COVID patient advocacy movement.
It's amazing, Fiona. Now that we are 7 months into COVID here in the United States, what continue to be some of the biggest issues for COVID patients right now?
So I think testing is still a huge issue. And it was great to hear from Ann Lee from CORE, because I think, she's really identified as well that this is a huge gap in the care that we're providing to people. So we know that, early on in the pandemic, it was difficult to access testing. And unfortunately, we're still dealing with the ramifications of that, because if you're a long haul COVID patient based in New York, for example, you most likely got sick in March or April, which means that's when you were trying to access testing. And many of those patients had initially mild symptoms, were told to ride it out at home, or even the ones who did have fairly serious symptoms were oftentimes turned away from hospitals and acute care centers because of the overwhelm. So those patients who were not able to test positive at the beginning of their symptom onset are now struggling to access additional paid time off from their employers because they have no, history of having COVID. Many of them are struggling to actually access proper care from doctors because when they go in for these long-term symptoms, again, they have no record of having had COVID. And some of them even face disbelief from family and friends. So I think it's important to note as well that, this emergence of long haul patients, of people who get sick with a virus and then develop, long-term complications, is not necessarily new. We've known for a long time that viral infections can have a variety of sequelae. We've seen in past pandemics and disease outbreaks that there are often survivors who end up developing long-term conditions or disabilities. The problem is that in the past, we generally just have not listened to these folks. And so I think that's the fear here as well. So one of the main things that patients are fighting for right now is, visibility, because visibility is huge in terms of just, I've had patients tell me that they've sent their boss or their employer an article that I've written about long COVID, and the employer, reads the piece and says, oh, I understand now, let me give you some more time off from work. Obviously, it's not always that simple. And so I think we also need the legal protections. We need better testing. And I think it's also key to mention that all of these issues are exacerbated for patients that are coming from marginalized communities. Medical bias and medical racism did not just disappear because of the pandemic. If anything, these issues, have gotten worse because healthcare providers are having to make split-second decisions. So a lot of the patients that I hear from who have been denied care from those communities.
Fiona, we have a number of questions coming in because I think we just don't hear enough about the kinds of things that long haulers are experiencing. So Lauren from LinkedIn wants to know, what is the largest symptom long haulers are having?
That's a great question. I think the most prevalent symptoms that I hear about, other than kind of the classic respiratory symptoms, are GI issues. People are having GI issues for months at a time, and that can result in, severe weight loss, and I think can contribute to fatigue. But neurological issues are also a huge problem. And that's something that we're seeing acknowledged now more in the mainstream media. But there's a patient in my support group who, for example, and I think this helps to flush out a little bit of some of, the added costs that being a COVID patient can create in addition to just healthcare bills. Her neurological symptoms are so bad that she doesn't trust herself to cook because she has, lit things on fire and, forgotten what she's doing midway through. So she now has to have all of her meals cooked by someone else or order in, right? So in addition to kind of the healthcare costs, we're also talking about patients having to take time off from work, having to, pay for caregiving. So those are some of the biggest symptoms I hear talked about, but we're also hearing about hair loss. We're hearing about reproductive issues for patients with menstrual cycles. So the virus really impacts every system of the body, and I think similarly every aspect of a patient's life.
Sandra from Facebook asks, what is being done about long haul effects that linger on?
That's a great question. Again, we are, I think, patient advocates, and people who are kind of emerging as patient advocates for COVID right now are trying to speak with health agencies and elected officials all over the world. People are asking for recognition. They're asking for rehabilitation. And there are a couple of COVID rehabilitation centers that are popping up in the U.S. There's one at Mount Sinai called the Post-COVID Center, the Center for Post-COVID Care. And so we need this situation to be approached holistically by healthcare providers. And there are some healthcare providers across the country and across the globe who are doing that. Unfortunately, it's not enough. And unfortunately, that care is still often based on having this positive diagnostic test result. So again, if you're one of those patients who either decided not to go out and get tested because you didn't want to risk infecting others, or who was actually turned away from testing, it can be very hard to access this care.
Her support group is called Body Politic, the COVID-19 support group. Fiona Lowenstein, thank you so much for your passionate advocacy. We're so proud of you and so proud to have you on our team. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be here with you.
Now, we've talked about testing being a key component to reopening safely, but we also recognize the importance of contact tracing. We had a chance to talk to some actual contact tracers about their job of tracking down those who may have been infected by a person recently diagnosed with COVID.
I work for the University of Kentucky as a contact tracer, in Lexington, Kentucky.
I'm a contact tracer for New York City Health and Hospitals.
I'm working as a disease investigator with the Madison County Health Department.
I'm a contact tracer at the University of Kentucky.
As a contact tracer, I'm responsible for calling individuals with a lab-confirmed positive diagnosis for COVID-19.
I think it's the best thing we got right now. Until there's a vaccine, I don't think it's going to solve it. I think it makes an environment we can live in that is somewhat livable.
Each call is different, but especially with freshmen, I can sense anxiety, a little bit of fear.
I've had the privilege of talking to a diverse group of people who speak languages including Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, Haitian Creole.
A couple of times I've been the one to deliver the news of a positive result when a patient hasn't heard about it already. Overwhelmingly, people have been helpful, wanting to isolate, quarantine, do what they can to help. We have, of course, seen people who respond by saying this whole COVID thing is being blown out of proportion.
When it hits home, it hits home. So if it's your parents and you've got to go home to isolate, that's scary. It's frightening thinking about the impacts of that and the decisions you have to make at such a young age. It's not fair.
I want to be that person to bring comfort to them and try and make this experience as normal as possible.
I truly appreciate all of the patience and participation of cases and contacts. It's people like you who let public health professionals like me and other medical professionals do as best as we can in order to stop the spread of COVID-19.
I'm encouraged by the wonderful team we have here in Kentucky and knowing that teams like this are working all across the country. But I think until we have a large-scale federal response, we're not going to be able to get it under control with just these separate teams working. I think with that extra support, we have all of the tools we need. We just need to listen to the experts on how to use them.
Those are voices of contact tracers here in the United States. Such an important job right now. I want to applaud, excuse me, all the men and women who are out there doing this work. And thank you all for watching. Thank you to our guests for being on the show today. Next week, we continue with the road to a vaccine, and we'll talk to some of the world's leading experts about kids and COVID. I know, like many of us, you have a lot of questions, so feel free to continue to send them our way. We'll see you next Tuesday.